Hello, everyone. Today, we're diving into an essential topic, European Cybersecurity Month, held every October to raise awareness about cybersecurity and promote best practices online. This year, the campaign theme is Or Think Before You Click, focusing on the rising challenge of social engineering. Scammers are becoming increasingly sophisticated, using techniques like identity fraud and phishing to prompt reckless actions and steal sensitive information. The goal is to empower both individuals and organizations to adopt safer practices in the digital space. To help us explore this topic further, we have a special guest, Diniz Cruz. He's the founder of the Cyber Boardroom, a member of OWASP, and an expert in cybersecurity and artificial intelligence. Dinis, I hand it over to you to discuss this important topic of generative artificial intelligence.
So I've been doing cybersecurity for a long time. I was born in Portugal. I used to call I'm from the Spectrum generation, the Spectrum, the 8086, and then the Amiga and all those computers. So I've been coding for a long time, and I kind of got into cybersecurity through the Hacking Exposed books. So I learned how to hack, all legally, of course, but I've learned how to break into systems, and they then got a lot of stuff in there. And then it was very involved in OWASP, like you mentioned. I was on the board. I did a bunch of conferences in Brazil, which is great. We did one in Campinas, one in Porto Alegre. I've been also to Recife and a couple of other places. So yeah, Brazil is very close to my heart. In fact, I was a musician in the Algarve, and I came to London first to become a musician. Then I went to computing. And when I was here, I was playing in a Brazilian band. I was the drummer. So I was playing lots of Daniela Mercury, Axé, Jardim, all the Brazilian sambas and stuff like that, which is really cool, and salsa. So yeah, so then I go into cybersecurity. I actually very strategically chose not to go into senior management until later in my career. And the reason I did that is by the time I got there, I still wanted to be the most technical person in the room. And I was. It was really good, because by the time that I was the CISO, I felt I still knew what I was talking about. I was probably one of the best AWS engineers in the room. I really understood the cloud. I really understood security. I really understood how to get systems done. So I highly recommend people to do that. Sometimes, I see a lot of my friends that go into management, and then, after a while, they understood the concepts, but didn't understood for real, right? So I've done that for a while. It was really cool being a CISO, run big teams. And then when GenAI came along, generative AI, especially ChatGPT, right? Up until then, my joke is like a lot of AI was a bit like blockchain. It was like an industry looking for a problem, looking for a solution, right? A solution looking for problems. And I always felt that a lot of the AI stuff that I saw, you could do better with cleaning the data. It felt very brute force. We didn't have any raw intelligence on it. And when I saw ChatGPT, and then I really looked into GenAI, I was like, no, this is different, right? And we're gonna go into it, but I felt this is a very different beast than the AI that I saw before, right? And again, I think there's a big distinction between what you can call the more machine learning AI, the traditional build the models, do one thing, in and out, inputs and outputs based on models, versus the generative AI, which actually creates content and creates these interesting models that I think we should talk about here. So yeah, then I kind of finished being a CISO about 6 months ago, and I'm doing a startup around GenAI. It's called Cyber Boardroom, although all the code is open source, which is really cool. So you guys could all use it. All the stuff I've been coding for the last 6 and before is all open source. And I'm kind of putting the ideas that I'm going to talk about here in practice. But I think it's GenAI, it's the next major revolution. And we're in a bit on that period where people are saying, well, it's not as important, it's not as big, it's a bit overhyped. The same way that people were saying that the internet was overhyped and the cloud was overhyped and mobile was overhyped. But I think this is bigger than all of that, right? It's going to be a massive change in how we operate for the better, right? And there's some side effects that we're going to have to deal with, but I think it represents a ridiculous opportunity all over cybersecurity, not just in technology, but also especially in cybersecurity.
Yeah, that's great. That's interesting. So, Denise, and what do you think that it's the most important thing when some company think about generative AI and how they can implement generative AI with their business?
So I did a couple presentations on this, and one of the things that I kind of arrived of sort of like when I kind of dig deep in the first summer last year, I went to Portugal. We drove, so I literally took like 40 books. Right, I bought books from all the way from maths to ML to everything. Right, so I was trying to read across the spectrum because I wanted to understand like where is the source. Right, is in the models, is in the logic, the frameworks, the teaching, the RAG, the teaching, the prompts, and what I realized, and this was before the context windows that we have now, right? I realized because you could modify so much the behavior on the prompts, I realized the name of the game is the prompts, right? That's where the action is. And then the more I look at the models and realize that they are not deterministic, they make up shit left, right, and center. I would call hallucinations, right? But it's basically making up things. But more importantly, they're not very deterministic in their output, right? And they can be games. I realize actually I don't want to build a model because building a model is very difficult and you have no idea what is actually how it's going to behave, right? Like I come from software engineer where I pay attention to like zeros and ones and micro behaviors, right? Like a bug for me is something I don't understand. Now in a model it's crazy, right? Like the thing behaves differently, right? Left, right, and center. And we went in security from a world where we try to separate code and data, like so deal with injection and all that stuff. And suddenly data is code, right? Like a prompt is literally the equivalent of code, right? So I start to realize like the last thing you want to do is build a model. The last thing you want to do is customize a model. Like literally stay away from that. And every time somebody asks me, how do you protect the data in a model? I'm like, you can't. You can't because we don't know how data is stored. So forget about that. The good news, especially in the last 6 months, is that the name of the game is you use multiple models off the shelf, some open source, depending, some closed, some whatever models you want to use, but you use them almost as a commodity. You use them as an input and output. In fact, the objective is to try to find the most efficient model for what you want to do. Like you don't need to use the most expensive and powerful model for some tasks. You might start there, but then ideally is to bring it down to very specific elements. And the other element of this is you want to bring your own content, right? So if you think about just a long way to answer your question is, so the way I think companies adopt GenAI is, first of all, find environments where they can access lots of models, right? And they already exist. Google has the Google Garden, AWS has Bedrock, OpenAI, Claude. I use Open Router a lot. There's a bunch of others. So find places where you can get models or even run your own with Olama and others. So you need to access models that you can run. Then you bring your own content to the prompts, and then you customize it with the prompts and with the objectives and what you want to do. You put it all together. You have a lot more control. And it's a lot more safe, right? Because there's lots less moving parts in there. So again, my advice is don't customize models, don't build your own models. Leverage the fact that there's lots of models that are now free or quasi-free, and then basically make sure that the action is in the prompts and in kind of the knowledge base that you give as part of that prompt, which a lot of people talk about RAG, and we can get into it, but it's basically is how do you give the context to the prompt and the audience to the prompts that you then ask the LLM to do something.
Yeah, that's great. So Denise, and when we talk about generative AI, we have some problems, right, regarding cybersecurity and data protection. So what do you think? What do you think about this?
Well, so I think there's multiple angles, right? So the interesting thing is that if you bring your own content to the Gen AI, then you back to AppSec, right? Basically, application security has always thought about data roles, protection, isolation, etc. Right? So if you bring your data to a model about a user and then destroy that, and for the next user you bring their data to the model, you have less of a problem, right? The problem happens when people want to use the same model for multiple users. Even worse, when they let the models learn. Like that again, that's the other thing. Never create a model that learns, right? Because a model that learns Because remember that we still don't understand how he learned, right? So a model that learns is the last thing you want to do, because that's when you have leakage between one user to another user, right? So if you look at data isolation, in fact, one of the things I did in the Cyber Boardroom was I designed it so I can run it everywhere. And that means that I can do a deployment that is on an isolated virtual machine, on an EC2 instance, on a Lambda function, on an AWS account, on a Kubernetes, and I use that compute as almost my isolation layer. So I can deploy one of these per customer if I wanted to, right? So I don't then have to worry about data protection. Because the other thing we have to be very careful is that, remember that we don't understand how these models work, right? So this model sits at the center of your environment. I fully expect models to be able to receive instructions that we don't understand that will trigger it to do something. Now, if that model happens to be in a very privileged situation or environment, that will be an attacker for you, right? So think about this way. So you want your models, not only they're vulnerable from the outside, they can also be one of your most dangerous insider threats if you don't control it. So if you do a threat model, you should ask yourself, what happens if we are attacked by that model, right? Like, what does that model actually, that network, that environment actually has access to, right? So I kind of have I like the zero trust sort of like minimal security model, where I don't trust the models and I don't trust the data going in. And I want to give them my own data. I want them to be read-only. And then I want, control the inputs and the outputs, which is then you can use multiple models in parallel. You can actually use one model to verify the other model. You can do some very cool tricks. And that's how I think you handle a lot of that data sort of confidentiality problem that you're talking about. Because, a very simple example is GDPR erasures, right? So if you've been in the risk side of cybersecurity, erasures is a big deal, right? Because the especially in Europe, right? So with erasures, the customers have the right to say, delete my data, right? And it's a legal right. And if you get it wrong, you get ridiculous fines. How do you do erasure in a model that has learned, where we don't know how he learned, right? And there's models that have been poisoned, like to have some behavior or behave in certain ways that then you can't unpoison later. I.e., the model becomes resistant to itself. So again, if you have a read-only model that is deterministic, that is a particular version, that doesn't change, you control the input, I think it's a much more sane way of dealing with GenAI. And AI in general, right? But especially GenAI.
Mhm. And would you like could you talk a little bit more about your project that it's related to GenAI, and
Yeah.
what's the main idea, the main goal that you have planned with your project?
So the main problem I'm trying to solve is the problem of how do you translate and communicate cybersecurity to execs, to stakeholders, and how they can interact with the data that they receive, right? So as a CISO, and when I was head of AppSec and I was doing cybersecurity, even when I was doing a pen test, right? The painful thing was always how do I explain what I know to the multiple stakeholders in the business, or from project managers to directors to basically to board members to etc. Right? The only difference that work as a CISO, you just have access to more senior people, but it's still the same question, and it's a problem of scale, right? As a CISO, you create relationships with the multiple people. You try, that's how you get stuff done, and the only way you can do that is to translate, right? You understand, Flavio, if you're a board member and you have an MBA and you have a particular inclination, then I'm going to speak differently to you, right? If Mario, he has a technical expertise, maybe on engineering, doesn't know cybersecurity, but has a lot of, security knowledge there, then, I'm going to speak different to you. We have Jéssica here, right? So Jéssica, let's say she's super expert in company structures. She has a huge pedigree in working on boards. She has a lot of knowledge, right, on governance and practices, etc. Again, I'm going to speak differently to her, right? So the problem is how you scale this, right? And the big moment for me was when I kind of understood how GenAI works, and the best picture I have is that what GenAI does is there's an air gap between the input and the output. So it creates stuff, right? But how does it create? the best explanation is it creates all these models internally. Imagine gigantic graphs of relationships, but it's not just a 2, 3, 4 dimensional relationships, it's thousands of relationships and thousands of dimensions. So for example, the reason why ChatGPT was able to learn English 90%, then being fed, 2% of content in Portuguese, and then being able to very cleverly translate, right, from English to Portuguese, but even from English from Portuguese, from Portugal, from Porto, and then Brazilian from Brazil, from Porto Seguro, which is going to be different than Brazilian in São Paulo, Brazilian in Rio, Brazil, in Recife, right? So, but how does it do it, right? It does it because the mental models that it creates are super rich, right? So it's not like one-to-one mappings. So when you want to talk about something, the translation is super effective. So then I realized that, hold on, I can use that to translate cybersecurity to an executive. And more importantly, not just to an executive, is to that person, that culture, that state, what they care about. In fact, even what they're interested in. Do they care about cybersecurity? Do they care about that? Do they care about finance only? Do they want a sense of humor? Do they want it to receive, a cybersecurity like, a Brazilian sort of football commentary, right? Like you can do all that stuff, right? And that's when, and now I realize the power. So the Cyber Boardroom is fundamentally trying to address that. It's trying to create these personas that you can say, I want to speak to these 4 board members or 4 executives. And then it's kind of like coming up with the workflows to translate that message to them. And then on the other side, you also have those personas, which tend to be on the receiving end of these cybersecurity dashboards and data. And most of those execs are like, what the F is this, right? Like, how do I process this? So the other interesting thing is to allow, for example, an executive or a board member, when they receive cybersecurity information from the company, to be able to engage with it. Say, look, can you translate this to English, right? Can you translate this to somebody that has experience in sport or in governance or in finance or in technology or in sports, whatever, right? So I'm kind of trying to figure out that communication workflow from both I'll call the professionals to the stakeholders and the stakeholders to the professionals.
Yeah, that's right. That's very interesting, Denise. You were a CISO in the past, right?
Yep,
And I believe that one of the biggest challenge that you had maybe it's the communication, right?
it is.
That's yeah.
The hardest thing, right? In fact, one of the things I realized is that in security, we do a terrible job at showing when we save the day. See, the interesting about security is that we are an enabling function. So when we do our job right, we enable the business. The problem is that we're not very good at showing people and executives and key stakeholders how much work we do for them. Because by definition, nothing happens, right? So it's kind of like, imagine, so one of my party tricks was to run P3 incidents, like medium level incidents, as P1s, as a major incident. So I would put, let's say there's a bit of customer fraud, I would put 50% of my team on that, right? So I wouldn't say how much fraud we're having. I would ask, why did the customer told us there was fraud? And then I investigate. Why did that, let's say, laptop was missed, and it was the person who lost the laptop that told us? Why was that file able to be executed? Why did this person access that data? All sorts of these incidents that happen all the time. So I would run them as P1s because we would practice, we would fix a bunch of stuff, but also was a great way to create relationships and to educate the business on what's going on. But the reality is that in cybersecurity, we save the day every day, but we don't do a good job at telling them, others, stakeholders, that that's happening, right? And that's a problem, because sometimes you do need to leverage, you do need to make changes, or you need budgets, right? And it's very easy to say, well, cybersecurity is a cost. And like, no, cybersecurity is a massive, a massive profit generation and a massive enabler, because when we get it right, it means that team over there didn't have to spend the weekend cleaning up the mess. That team over there didn't have to spend time, instead of developing the next feature, dealing with an incident, right? So I think there's all these things that in the past we couldn't scale because we didn't have a good ability to communicate. Like, come on, if you go to an incident responder, right, and you say, I need you to create me a full project plan. I want a budget. I want to understand your impact on the EBITDA. I want KPIs aligned to this. That person is going to say, F you, right? It's like, there's no way I'm doing any of that, right? But now we can't. Now we can translate what is that SOC engineer, whether it's AppSec engineer, that risk analyst, that security engineer, what is that person doing? How does that connect all the way up to the particular stakeholders? We're not there yet, but I finally can see how we can do that. And it's really cool.
Yeah, that's right. So Diniz, imagine that I am the responsible for I'm the head of IT, and I would like to integrate our platform, our software, uh, using generative AI. So what's your recommendation? What's your just related to cyber, but at all, what's your recommendation for
So
the
the first one is start using it, right? Like start using GPT-4, Claude 3. I've been using Claude 3 recently, super impressed with Claude 3. There's a pile of them, right? Start using them. But it's not just the chat. Start using them to have conversations. And I was talking to Mario about, the same way that Mario you're using to learn the language. You can use it to learn technology. You can use it to refine things. I have full-blown debates, right, with the models, right? And it's not a lie, right? It's not a person. In fact, I like the fact that they don't have bias. I like the fact, not bias, that more in like at the level of that we tend to have in humans, right? I like the fact that they don't have emotions. They don't have this sort of like extra baggage that sometimes you get, right, when you're trying to have debates, right? So and of course, it's a tool, but it's a very different tool. And I think that's the most important thing, is that people need to understand that in the if you think about it, in the past, most of the revolutions that we had, the compute, the cloud, the mobile, it was kind of like we got it there, and then it was just a case of getting a bit faster, a bit better, right? There wasn't a big difference, right, in some of the evolutions. There was major changes every now and then, but this is still getting better, right? I think we're going to reach a point where in a way the models are already very good. We don't need much models that are much better, right? And but the key is to start to use it. And just clear, when I say don't have bias, of course that every model has a particular bias, but at least you can understand what it is and you can deal with it. And if you bring your own content, in a way, the bias becomes your bias, which is fine, because that's what you want, right? But I think the most important thing for teams is to find very simple use cases, and most of their use cases where it's not about adding GenAI as a black box. I have to say 90% of the startups I see and the use case I see, they kind of treating GenAI as a black box. They go, oh, I got this thing, I threw it over the fence and I get a result on the other end. And then it goes, oh, it doesn't work, or there's some problems. Like that. That's not how you want to do it. You want to think about provenance. You want to think about deterministic. You want to think about the fact that you have a technology that can understand data, but can understand data in a way that we never had before, right? You can give it a TCP dump. You can give it an IP config. You can give it GitHub diffs. You can give it all sorts of very complex data, or data that keep from 5 different versions of the same API, and is able to easily connect the dots and going, okay, this is how he processes it, right? So I think it's about finding very simple use cases that he adds a lot of value, and then it's about thinking about the CI pipeline, because that's the other thing people are not spending as much time thinking about. It is, you can do a proof of concept, that's all nice and good, but it needs to be deployed, right? It needs to run on the pipeline. It needs to be consistent. You need to version it. Like all that stuff needs all the good old DevOps and Sec DevOps and cybersecurity and engineering. We need to apply that to it, right? Or else you got some really cool proof of concepts that don't actually survive, in a real world. Which is, by the way, what happened to a lot of people, a lot of companies, right? A lot of companies that bought the hype because there was crazy opportunity, and now they're going, well, where's the value, right?
Yeah, and Diniz, one good question. When we talk about implement some generative AI, will have some challenges regarding the cost of the solution, right?
Yeah.
So, what do you think? How can we implement generative AI or use generative AI? Um, Thinking a little bit regarding this
Yeah, yes, of
related to
course.
cost.
So first of all, I would say if you are doing a Gen AI today and you start to have a massive cost problem, unless you have bazillions of users, right, which I probably doubt in the beginning, you're doing something wrong, right? Because there's two things here, right? The only time it gets really expensive is when you keep throwing data into a chat, right? And you're paying for it. Because the problem here is that if you think about it, the chat grows exponentially, right? Because if you send everything all the time to the chat, means that you ask a question, then it gives you an answer, and then you send the question answers to the chat, and then the next question. So literally every question exponentially grows, right? So of course the cost grows exponentially, right? So you don't want to do that. But the other thing is that now there's a lot of not only very cheap models that are as good as probably what you need, right? There's also free models. So so I want to cover them separately, right? The free models are basically broken into the stuff you can run on your compute with Olama, and the basic Olama allows to run models. There's a lot of open source models that you can run, but there's also this interesting market evolution, which is there's a couple of companies who are creating microchips to compete with NVIDIA. So there's one called Grok with a Q, and there's another called Open Samba. I don't think they're Brazilian, or I think there's a Brazilian connection, right? Because they literally call Open Samba. No, they call Samba Nova. Sorry, Samba Nova. That's the name of the company. So they have. I think there's a Brazilian connection there, right? But what they do is they're making a microchip to compete with NVIDIA, which basically means that they basically claim that it's super cheap to run and fast to run the models. So they actually give you for free, Llama 3.2, right? There's endpoints that you can hit for free, right? Which a crazy amount of performance that you can use. Now, you might want to use that for sensitive data, but you can do that for a lot of development and experiments, right? And they're still there. But the other models, like Gemini, just pushed one that has 100,000, another has 1 million tokens, and it costs like 0.3 cents per million. Right? Like, come on, you need to spend a lot of data, right, to spend a decent amount of money there. So unless you're doing something wrong, right, those models you are abusing. And then the other thing is there are models that are expensive. Claude 3 is more expensive. Open AI 4.0 and O1 is expensive comparatively, but you should be using them for everything, right? The point here is that there's some questions you might want to have the expensive model to operate, but I would argue 90% of the workloads you have, you don't need those models. You can use either cheap, free ones, or free that you run on your own hardware if you want them. So I guess my question is, you show me somebody who's spending a lot of money on models today, I almost bet with you that what their problem is not the models, is their workflow, their inefficiency. They're treating as a black box, and they're not understanding what actually goes in those prompts.
Yeah, that's exactly. I totally agree with you, Diniz. And Diniz, you you are living for a long time in London, so you were born here in Portugal.
Yeah.
So I would like to ask you some tips related to career or related to some tips that you would like to give us, or for someone that is listening us. What do you would you like to talk
So
about career or any other
So
tips?
I think we're very lucky that we are in careers that even 20 years in, 30 years in, there's space for everybody, right? There's space for the new joiners, there's space for the people with experience, right? And we also not in a career state where it's very hard to get in. So the good news is very easy to get into cybersecurity. Now it's very easy to get into GenAI. And I'm a big fan of, especially on what I call skills transfer and jobs transfer, is when you take somebody from a different role and you bring them for them to cybersecurity, right? Because they have a lot to give, right? And I think the reverse too. I think cybersecurity should also do other roles, because I think we see things differently. So the first time is, this is a ridiculous great time, right, to join cybersecurity, to join the GenAI, because there's still so much to do. In fact, the cybersecurity world is going to probably have more change in the next 3 years than he had in the last 20, right? Because the cybersecurity has always played on a lot of inefficiencies, things don't really connect to each other, lots of tools that don't really integrate, lots of patches, lots of stuff, and we never really handle well the data, transformation, and that's going to change. So I think cybersecurity is super exciting to get into, and I think Gen AI, literally you pick whatever you would like to do, from attacking a Gen AI to defending Gen AI to governance of Gen AI. Literally, we need them all, right? And it's still so much to discover. So my main advice, right? So I kind of have two, right? First of all is, first of all, present yourself better. So I always ask when we were hired, I asked the candidates to create a presentation about themselves, right? And it's not because I want to see how well they create presentations, is I want to see what else is there, how they think. If they chose 5 pictures for a topic, there's going to be a history behind those 5 pictures, right? And I'm also very interested in what else they do, right? We hired somebody that worked in a hospital. We hired somebody that play professional sports, another was professional cyclist, another worked as a barista in a coffee shop, another one was working in other places. So I think those things make you, right? So and a CV doesn't show that. Like, a CV is a horrible way. I don't read CVs anymore, right? Because it doesn't really tell you who you are. So the first of all is create a presentation about you that really shines, and then the second one is, when you're looking for roles, act in that role. Send a presentation about what you want to do, right? Behave like you're part of whatever company you want to go for, and give them your ideas, because ideas are a dime a dozen, right? Like, the problem is how to execute them. Right? So if you do that, and especially, for example, participate in open source projects. OWASP has some great projects. Hey, my projects are open source. Participate, right? But if I see somebody who has 5 commits accepted by an OWASP project, that tells me more than whatever they put on their CV, right? And not just that, a lot of people in that industry they are part of, our industry is not that big, right? Like, they will know people who are hiring. There's a great way. So look, hack your way into the industry, because, to be fair, that's what we all did. We all hack our way into an industry, right? There's a long time where people will go, hey, can you audit this language? I always go, yeah, of course I can. Yeah. And then I would go buy some books on Amazon, read it on a train, and then figure it out when I got there, right? Like we ad lib it all the time, right? But threat modeling, for a while we were just making all the whole shit up, right? So the good news is you can still do that today, right? So we're still very immature as an industry that you can get in, and especially if you come from other industries, right? So we talk a lot sometimes about imposter syndrome, which is a problem. Actually, women tend to have it more than men, but some men also have it, which is people downplay what they do. They don't think they're good enough, or it's crazy, and then sometimes they don't apply for roles. But there's also this idea of imposter syndrome, where they don't even think they should be there. Right? They feel, oh, I shouldn't be in that industry. And I think there is so much talent, right, that should become the cybersecurity, because we need as much talent as we can get, right? And especially things are we're gonna get on a bumpy ride, because the attackers are also using Gen AI to do this. And if you think the phishing attacks were phishing in the past, it's gonna go a complete different level, right? So I think it's gonna be bumpy for a little while. Although I think we will have, on the defense, we will have the edge, because we also can do that stuff. But it's a great time to join the industry. And so contribute open source, create presentations about you, and when you apply for a job, send them your ideas. Actually, I'm a big fan. Post on LinkedIn. If you search in LinkedIn, there's a presentation there for me for a company called Babylon Health, right? That is when I applied for a CISO. So I literally was applying for a CISO. I did some research, going, hey, this is kind of cool research. I took their template, created a presentation. Okay, you don't need to create a 50-page deck all the time, but I want to capture my research. And then I send them through LinkedIn. And I says, hey, if you like, this is what you want, this is me.
Yeah.
There you go, right?
Yeah. And just the last question, Diniz. I believe that generative AI is change. It's a big milestone when we talk about technology, right? And what do you think? how do you think the future of technology will look in 10 years?
I think we're entering a new phase where now we start to have technology that can understand context. And we never really had that. Like in the past, we had to codify all that. We had to codify the application logic. We have to codify the behaviors. Everything had to be code. And I think, and that's why it was so hard. That's why teams took a long time. And of course, code, the more you do it, if you don't clean the technical debt, becomes harder and harder to make changes, right? I think we get into a very interesting world where software becomes a lot more fluid, right? The thing about it is you still need a ridiculous amount of good engineering, right? So good engineering is not going to go away. These people who say we're not going to get, there's not going to be programmers in 10 years from now, they have, maybe some of the way that they don't exist, they exist today, they won't be in 10 years from now. But the idea of programming, the idea of solving problems, the idea of connecting the dots, right, is even more important, especially the more non-programmers people you have creating things, the more important is you make sure that whatever they create then actually is solid, is secure, is robust, and it doesn't blow up half the company, right? So I think we are in areas where also I feel the impact on technology in the companies is going to be much bigger. Like if you look at most companies, they're still very analog, right? Like freaking most business run on spreadsheets, right? Literally, which is ridiculous, right? Like the amount of automation, the amount of technology sort of products or say workflows is still very limited. So I think just that, that gives your next 10 years of stuff. And I think the models, look, I think they're going to get better. There is a part of it where it needs to be controlled the same way that we did nuclear weapons and stuff like that, especially on the kind of self-learning and build itself, right? It needs to be a bit under controlled. But I feel that the opportunities that we have with this are massive, right? And I feel that now is a great time to be, in technology, and in security. So, it's really cool in 2024, right? Still a lot to do.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. So, Denise, thank you. Thank you very much for your time. Thank you for your presentation. So, I will share your LinkedIn on our YouTube page, right? So, if you want, anyone would like to do some question for Denise, you can contact Denise
Yeah,
directly.
yeah. We put the
And
link there to the Cyber Boardroom, which is literally cyberboardroom.com, right? And also there's a bunch of open source repos that you can copy. There's a community version you can run from your laptop. And I would argue there's a lot of really cool patterns that I pushed and open sourced that I think are worth looking at it and learning and copying and improving, right?